Hello, everybody. My name is Katoha Kudo, and today we are joined by Christy Ellis, currently in California. And we will be talking about discrimination that she experienced while attending an Asian international school throughout high school. So, Christina, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so hi, my name is Christy. I was born in Singapore. I went to a local all-girls school there until I was 12. My family then decided to move to Beijing, China, where I attended an international school from 7th grade until I graduated from high school.
Mhm. Perfect. So a little bit about who we are as Reset Revolution right before we get or dive into the actual interview. Reset Revolution is a group of high school students from international schools where we try to target and raise awareness about different social injustice issues, including the one where we will be talking about today of discrimination in international schools, especially because it is a topic that is not given that much attention. So let's just dive straight into the interview. So, could you give us an overview of what your experience was like living in Beijing and attending an international school there?
I would say my experience, I would consider myself very fortunate to have lived overseas, to have lived in a different country, to have attended an international school. It meant being able to compete athletically on a global scale. It meant exposure to the world and to Chinese culture, plenty of learning and leadership opportunities. And I would say my international school was very involved with the community. But at the same time, the community had very distinct and isolated groups, which made it very hard to fit in the first couple months there.
hmm So, you said a little bit about the isolated groups in your international school. Could you give us a little bit of detail of how your student body or faculty looked like in terms of, racial proportions?
Yeah, so I was definitely used to being the only Black kid. Over time, there was always either one or two other Black students in my grade. By my sophomore year, there was only one other Black kid, and that continued until I graduated. In my time, I had only known of five other Black teachers going from elementary school to high school, but I never interacted with them. I was never taught by any of them. But beyond the Black community, there is very little diversity. The majority of my teachers were white males, aside from if they were teaching a language. And the majority of my peers were Asian, specifically of East Asian descent.
It's really interesting how the faculty is mostly white males, specifically. So, what are some specific instances where you felt discriminated as, one of the only Black girls in your grade, even in your school, whether that's at school or in a public location in Beijing?
So I would say that there were definitely times of explicit racism. But I think what had the most impact on me were the experiences of microaggressions or micro invalidations. In my letter, I talked about this KKK incident in which a peer had made jokes about the KKK. And, I approached this peer saying, I felt disrespected. I felt uncomfortable. And in response, I was told by this peer and by people online, by my other peers, to stop being so sensitive, that I needed to learn how to take a joke. So oftentimes I felt like my feelings were being invalidated.
Mhm.
I recall another time where I did well in my language class, and a peer told me that I only got a good grade because I'm Black.
Mm.
So oftentimes it felt as if, me being successful in any area was attributed to me being Black. So at school was one thing. And then to address, living in Asia, living in China, it's a country where there's a history of anti-Blackness, discrimination, racism. And I think initially, in understanding that, my attitude was to kind of let things slide in public, understanding that sometimes the discrimination I was experiencing was because of a lack of exposure, living in a place where the majority of the population looked a certain way. So to me, I felt like that then attributed a certain degree of responsibility
Mhm.
as a type of ambassador for the Black community.
Mhm.
In public, I recall I was going up the elevator with my sister, and some woman walks in and she just starts blurting out random countries.
Mm.
And it wasn't until later when I realized that she was trying to guess where we were from. She had
Mm.
determined that we were Cuban. But there was no greeting. We didn't know each other, just a complete stranger.
Mhm.
So things like that, going out in public, people trying to touch your hair, take photos of you staring at you.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, the only exposure that most people had with the Black community were through their screens.
Mhm.
So my parents were going to rent a new house, for example, and this woman, the owner, was hesitant to rent to them because she believed that Black people were dirty.
Mm.
Um, so in those types of instances, it made things very hard, especially the first few months there. And, my mother believed that at home and at school were the two places where I could truly express myself without fear of judgment, without feeling like there was this responsibility to be an ambassador.
Mhm.
And, I think she was right to think that it's an international school. So rightfully, there should already be a certain degree of um, cultural sensitivity and awareness
Mhm.
towards different races and different cultures.
Mhm. Another question that we actually got from one of our viewers on Reset Revolution is how the administration responded, your school administration responded to these.
Um, so in terms of reporting, um, you know, when these microaggressions or micro invalidations would occur, um, I wouldn't report it. It only is upon reflecting when you realize that's what it was. Because in the moment, you just feel hurt, you feel angry, you don't completely understand.
Mhm.
Um, but the two times that I chose to report, the first being with the KKK incident, you know, I had gone through all of the cyberbullying as a result of the incident. Um, and when my mom found out, she wanted me to take a mental break because I had broken down. And so she contacted my counselor and told my counselor, she's not going to be able to make this meeting for a club because this is what happened. And in response, my counselor told my mom that if I did not attend this meeting, um, I would be kicked out of the club.
Mm.
So, I had a choice to make.
Mm.
Um, and to me, the club was extremely important. I ended up becoming president of this club my senior year. And the club's main goal was to, cultivate kindness and empathy within the community and also help facilitate new student transitions. And for me, remembering how hard it was for me to transition into that community, I never wanted another kid to have to go through that.
Mm.
So I ended up going to that meeting.
Mm.
Um, and so for a long time after that, uh, I did not want to report anything,
Mhm.
just because I felt completely unsupported.
Mhm.
And then my junior year, a peer had used the N word. And so that was an incident I decided to report.
Mhm.
And in response, I was pressured by my school's administration to have a sit down with him, though I chose not to. I was given a half hearted apology.
Mm.
And, you know, the way they dealt with it had me feeling constantly um, vulnerable. My one request after reporting was that I would not have to be around this student. Um, And, instead I spent the rest of the year sitting across from him in history class,
Mm,
where he continued to make microaggressions. Um,
mm,
and I recall just being scared to walk down the hallway.
mhm.
Um, and one afternoon, he decided that he was going to corner me in the hallway.
Wow.
And, teachers were around, they saw, um, and they chose to do nothing.
Mm,
So, the way that the school's administration had chosen to handle things um, almost made me wish that I hadn't said anything.
mm,
Um, I, for a long time after that, just felt scared to go to school. And so after I had thought that most of this had blown over, like weeks later, my high school principal called me into his office and he demanded that I stop spreading rumors about this peer because this peer had done his time and that I needed to get over it. Um, and so, that was kind of my image of my school's administration and faculty, that
yeah.
not only would they not support me, um, not only would they not pursue action, but they would, you know, turn to me and see me as the bad guy.
Mm. I'm so sorry that happened. It's a whole reversal about how your mom thought about how school is going to be, the comfortable place where you could actually express yourself. Wow, that's actually really shocking. As an East Asian person myself, like from Japan, like I'm not completely sure if it is to the extent to which China is, or it might be worse, but anti-blackness is a huge issue, especially because I think a lot of East Asian, like, communities and stuff, they're very homogenous. There's literally one
Mhm.
race, there's one way of living, and I'm really sorry that you had to go through that, especially at an international school. So it sounds like the faculty literally gave you no backup, no sympathy whatsoever in order to handle the situation. And you talked a little bit about your letter that you wrote to the International School of Asian Community. And when I read your letter, there's this like hint of what your older sister used to say about developing a thick skin before moving to Beijing. But could you explain why she specifically told you to do so and how these exact words actually apply to your life later when you did move to Beijing?
So even before moving to China, I'd always been extremely sensitive. At that age, my focus was on being able to fit in. So, it would really get to me when people were able to call out what made me stand out. And oftentimes, that was my skin, that was my hair. And it would really bother me when that would happen. And my sister had attended an international school in Singapore. And I think she knew that me going to an international school would mean that I would meet really two kinds of people, people who either did not know or did not understand what racial sensitivity looked like for the Black community. But then there would also be those who knew and who understood, but would choose to ignore that and would prey on that as a way to bring people down. And, my sister, I think that was the one piece of advice she could give me in order to help me get through the day.
Mhm,
Um, you know, the explicit racism, the microaggressions in public and at school, I think that was her way of telling me that, I needed to pick my battles.
mhm,
Obviously, on the inside, you want to fight every time that you feel wronged.
mhm,
Um, but that would leave you emotionally and mentally exhausted, and make you feel like you're constantly in a state of vulnerability. So I think that was her way of trying to protect me, um, and trying to let me understand that, I can't control everything. I can't control how people see me, but I can control what I respond to and what I let hurt me. So I think in the bigger picture, that was a lesson that I carried with me throughout my time at that international school. But looking back, it was what I had to do to get through the day, but it shouldn't be something that I had to do.
Mhm.
Um, you know, None of it was okay. And I think that's kind of the issue I was addressing in my letter, that, there were so many things that you had to simply let slide if you wanted to be okay, if you wanted to get through the school year.
Mhm.
And it should have never been that way.
Mhm. Yeah. That letter of yours was really, really powerful. And I talked to you about this like earlier, but I read it maybe when you posted it. So I'm guessing like May-ish. I don't know when that was.
Mm.
But yeah, when I read it, I was like, wow, it gave me a whole new perspective of, international schools. And I currently attend an international school in Europe as an Asian person. And just knowing that there's discrimination in an Asian international school against the Black girl, it was just, like basically in the same like international school community, but this new perspective that was added, it was mind blowing. But so can you give me like an idea of what specifically motivated you in order to write that letter, especially then and there?
I would say that the letter was a long time coming. Around the time of graduation was also the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's when it was really starting to gain momentum outside of the West. And in that time, I had seen so many statements by my peers that left me feeling extremely frustrated, angry, and upset, because these were the same peers who would sit by and say nothing
Mhm.
when I was being discriminated against. So I felt like, once again, my peers were taking away my voice in order to make themselves feel better, in order to make themselves feel like, they were doing the right thing. And those who weren't making statements, they were posting little black screens with a hashtag,
Mm,
which really did nothing. And, in trying to respond, my school decided to have an alumni discussion
mhm,
during which, I shared my experiences. My sister shared her experiences, and I felt like the school administration still wasn't getting the message. You can say you're sorry, but what I wanted to see was action happen. And so that's kind of the motivation behind the letter, was to get them to understand, this is what your guys' lack of action has done. This is the school community that has left me traumatized. And so, other than sharing it on social media because I felt like it's something that my peers had to read, I also sent it to my teachers going back to seventh grade in the hopes that they would finally understand exactly what it was like.
mhm. Yeah, that's a really powerful decision to do. So you talked a little bit about how the school hasn't really done much since the alumni meeting that you had, but have they like done literally nothing since the meeting?
So I would say that I don't have much information, partly because after I shared the letter, I was left very vulnerable, emotionally exhausted,
Hmm.
and it had brought up a lot of things that I didn't really want to think about.
Hmm.
Um, so there was that, but I would also say that from my knowledge, they brought in an expert or a professional of some sort to kind of identify the areas in which my school could increase their diversity.
Hmm. Hmm. It's a very small step, but I guess it's really powerful that your text actually got them to start doing stuff and them realizing that it has to be in the now, especially when this issue is such a big deal this year, hopefully next year as well, where more attention is brought to it and more action is done about it. So it's a little slow, but at least it's something. You said that you took history there, and I just kind of want to go a little bit with the maybe the education curricula, because I know that a lot, like a huge part of the lack of education and understanding of, racism and stuff is rooted within the education in international schools. So is there anything you'd like to say about how the education system maybe potentially, or like the media outlets potentially had fueled or added fuel to the fire of racism in your school?
Um, I would say that the lack of interaction with the Black community fueled stereotypes. For example, when I did an exchange program with someone at a local school, suddenly I found myself having to explain that, yes, I am American because there are Black people who are from America. Um, I had to explain that, being Black does not necessarily mean that I'm good at basketball. And just a lot of things that, I never thought I would have to explain. Um, I think history class um, has the power to kind of change the narrative. My first 2 years of high school, I would say history was very limited to world wars,
Mhm,
which are important to learn about. Um, but at the same time, unless students were planning on taking IB history, that's kind of where it ends.
mm,
Um, so not having any exposure to different communities, specifically the Black community, other than learning that they were slaves.
mhm,
Um, and, that then creates this kind of mental image of Black people being less than. You
mm,
know, you're never taught to see a Black person in a position of power. And so, in that aspect, that's where the curriculum needs to change.
mhm,
It's needing more exposure
mhm,
to different cultures, to different races, and not from a single lens where they are seen as inferior.
mhm. So in your letter, you also talked a little bit about what international schools as a whole could potentially do in order to, combat this issue. Could you maybe go and like go ahead and detail out some of the examples that you listed? In
Yeah. So, in my letter, I mentioned, changing the curriculum. Number one, that's definitely where it needs to start. Um, oftentimes I felt like whenever the Black community was brought up, there's suddenly a pressure and, eyes turn to you in a classroom and, suddenly it's your responsibility to speak on behalf of a whole community. So it's kind of like this balance in being able to lead a discussion um, without making students in the room feel like they're being pressured to talk about their community, to speak up for their community. Another way to move forward is to bring in more diversity. I mentioned I mainly had white males as my teachers. I've never had a Black teacher. And even if it's not necessarily from the Black community, having more teachers of color, having more teachers just from around the world to make the school truly international. Um, and in doing so, I think then the student body is able to kind of change their view. It also allows the conversation to change. It changes who is talking. Um, and I think the biggest issue that I would hope to see change is teaching administration and teaching faculty how to deal with situations when they are reported. I've said that how my situations were handled made me wish I had never spoken up in the first place. And that should never be the case. So it's educating the teachers um, in understanding this is how you deal with these situations.
mhm. Yeah, even though, your experience is mostly based in an Asian international school, I think it's definitely applicable to all schools, not just international schools, not just private schools, not those just in Asia. But, this understanding and education has to be facilitated throughout the world. thank you very much for participating in our interview today. We will be sharing the letter, if that's all right with you, on our account as well. Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for participating, and we hope to see you in our next interview. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.